All right, welcome to chapter 21. I believe this is part 3 of our French Revolution unit. Let's get into it. So, revolution brought reform and terror. Go ahead and read chapter 21.2 and come back to this for the chapter review with the rest of us. Okay, so welcome back, and I think that this is going to take a little bit of time to get through. There's quite a bit of information here, so bear with us, and if you have to chunk it down into smaller portions, by all means do so. Anyways, let's get into this one. In this chapter, we looked a little bit further on into the early parts of the French Revolution. So let's go ahead and see what's going on here. So as we saw last chapter, the National Assembly had taken power, and the National Assembly voted to end feudalism, serfdom, church tithe, special privileges of nobles and clergy, essentially killing the old regime. And we could see why they would have been motivated to do that. And once they're given power and granted the ability to do that, why that might be their first objective to do. So as we could see, by very early on, a lot of those early things about the old regime that were distasteful to the Third Estate were destroyed. So no longer were the clergy and the nobility riding on the backs of the peasantry. Okay? Now, we already spoke a little bit about the Great Fear. As the Great Fear is terrorizing the countryside, the National Assembly votes to eliminate a lot of these things in the old regime. And it was in 1789 when early in the revolution as it was beginning. And we already see early on this slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And this means essentially freedom, equality, and fraternity being kind of like brotherhood or unity, citizen brotherhood. In other words, kind of an extension of equality in the sense that, listen, no, you're not superior. There's brotherhood here. We're all French, right? Kind of actually becomes a slogan of national pride in being French as well. We are Frenchmen, right? Oui, oui, oui. Anyways, so the one way that the First Estate, the clergy, was abolished was through the adoption of the civil constitution of the clergy. And as it was passed, what it does is essentially puts the church, the Catholic Church, under the control of the state. The appointment of bishops and the division of regions and whatnot, dioceses that the was running the church. Okay, that's interesting because it takes that power of appointment out of the hands of an external power, being the Pope, and so it puts prime power in the control of the state, even in matters of religion and the national religion of Catholicism. By 1791, France had evolved into a limited constitutional monarchy. The king still had a role within the government, and he needed the legislative powers of the French citizens in their government to operate. So he didn't have absolute power anymore. It was a constitutional monarchy. Remember, this was something modeled after the British form of government, which had existed for many, many years at this point with a constitutional monarchy. The French system of government had an elected assembly as the legislative body, so appointment by election. So we could see that ideas of liberty and equality and the say of the people and the will of the people was being considered here. And the king still had executive powers under his constitutional monarchy here. What ends up happening is that the government confiscates church property because it's adopted the civil constitution of the clergy as the church comes under government control. Now, what this ends up doing is angering the more rural people of the Third Estate, or the former Third Estate, the farmers and peasantry, who really, really loved and were devoted to their faith. And they saw it being uprooted like this. And that actually made them a lot less willing to participate in any further revolutionary action. So primarily by this point, and from this point forward, any further revolutionary action comes not necessarily from everybody in the Third Estate, but from the bourgeoisie, which we remember are the educated and wealthy members of that Third Estate. The interesting thing about the First Estate clergy through the civil constitution of the clergy is that they needed to take an oath of allegiance or whatnot of the authority of the state. And many refused because their authority was not to the state, but to God or even to the Pope or to their bishops, whatever. And it would have been heroic, I think, of the clergy for religious valor and religious reasons to actually deny or refuse that oath. And a lot of them faced imprisonment and later death in the revolution. The revolution killed a lot of clergy. Okay, so we move on with looking at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This is interesting because it looks kind of like, a Declaration of Rights. Uh, a lot of these lines should be things that we see in Enlightenment thinkers and in their writing, as well as like the documents such as the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and things like that. Here's some quotes here. This was August 27th, 1789, where this was adopted. So early in the Revolution, and the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen uh, say this, that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Or the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural rights of man. So politics is meant out to look out for the rights and liberties of humankind. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. So we see all these Enlightenment ideals coming out in this document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And you can see how this is looking out for the equality of the French people and the demands that they're making because of their unfair treatment under the absolute power of the old regime, of the king of the old regime. Okay? So we have an emphasis on a couple freedoms here. For instance, freedom of speech, equality, regardless of social class, and actually freedom of religion, which is an interesting one. There were other, Protestants and Jews and whatnot in France that were a lot of times persecuted because they weren't Catholic or the state religion. So the French Revolution early on does open up more freedom of religion. It still considers religion, which is a good thing. Later on, it would not. Okay, now as things are escalating, what ends up happening is that Louis and his family are seeing this stuff unfold, and he actually tries to escape with his family to an Austrian territory disguised. They were recognized because of his image on money, and they were captured then, brought back to Paris, and they would actually never again leave Paris. His attempted escape undermined the trust that people would have had in him at that point. It was still a constitutional monarchy. He still had some essence of power or whatnot, but like at this point, he undermined all of that, and it was probably really bad for him to at least be caught. If he had escaped, that might have been different. But his most radical enemies at this point would never forget this. And this would be something that would be detrimental to his reputation from here on in. His attempted escape did not work. And we also see that eventually there is the National Assembly segues into the Legislative Assembly. Okay, it does eventually complete its new constitution in September of 1791. So it's like 2 years later since they had the tennis court oath and they vowed to create a constitution. So eventually they do that. And what that does, it replaces the Legislative Assembly with a newly elected government, which is called the Legislative Assembly. Did I say that? The National Assembly replaces itself with the Legislative Assembly in 1791. The Legislative Assembly then becomes the government of France. The continued government dysfunctions and the varying demands of different groups begin to create groups within the Legislative Assembly. It's not extremely functional a government. Not everybody's on the same page, in other words. Okay, some demand more change, others not so much, and others just sit in the middle with some stability. The National Assembly, as we said, it says here, steps down. From there, a newly elected group, Legislative Assembly, takes power. And let's go ahead and see what makes up this government. Okay, they begin to meet in a hall or a big room or whatnot, and the conservatives would sit on the right. So because of that, they were called the right wing, and they sit on the right in the room. The radicals will sit on the left, as we'll look at, and they were called left wing. Now, the conservatives opposed more changes. They trusted the king and the limited monarchy, and they were kind of happy with the way things were and wouldn't have wanted any more change. In fact, they may have leaned towards opposing further change or changes that had already been made. The radicals sat on the left. They were called left wing. They did not like the king. They wanted full reform and changes, and a lot of the radicals were really radical. That's why they're called radicals. And the centrists or moderates in the middle were called centrists. They sat in the middle. They wanted some reforms, but really they could kind of sit between both of these sides. It's interesting because we see these terms today, right wing, left wing in politics, conservative and radical. We don't use radical, we use liberal in politics today, which is quite interesting. This comes from the French Revolution, as our text says, which is kind of neat. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about further groups in France. On the right, there were the émigrés. So another conservative group were the émigrés. And a lot of them, they were called émigrés because they were French nobility, second estate, people who had fled France during the French Revolution for safety in other countries. They didn't live within France, yet they were still powerful and kind of working towards some sort of solution. They, of course, wanted to restore the old regime and were very conservative, the émigrés. On the left, there was such a group called the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune was influential throughout France because it was so influential in Paris. And it was made up of a lot of the working classes of the city of Paris, of the Third Estate, and led by the bourgeoisie, and very, very radical, as we'll see, takes a lead in the French Revolution. Okay, so interestingly enough, time ticks away. They work with the Legislative Assembly, however, and this constitutional government. However, outside forces in Europe are kind of looking at the French Revolution and trying to intervene. The Austrians and Prussians and British would be forces of taking concern in this. The Austrians and Prussians actually march right to Paris, defeating this pathetic French army at the time. And they say, don't harm the royal family. And this actually makes the mob extremely angry. The Parisian radicals actually move towards influencing the Legislative Assembly to be abolished and create the National Convention in anger against the monarch. And what that does is it ends the French government from being a constitutional monarchy, and by putting power into the new government, the National Convention, which is yet another change of French government at the time, 1792, France is made a republic and actually has no need for a king. Very interesting here. So it abolishes the monarchy, makes France a republic, and gives all men the right to vote. Okay, so we look a little bit about what's going on in the backgrounds. We can see that the radicals are really beginning to take the lead and the power here. With the abolition of the monarchy, I don't think anybody would have thought it would have gone that far, but it does. And there's even worse to come at this point. So a lot of these mobs were led by the bourgeoisie. Even though they were mostly made up of the poorer classes, those poorer classes were really influenced by the oratory and speaking skills and ideas spread by the bourgeoisie largely. And people in the urban centers would join these political clubs to share and spread their ideas. They would be, ways to get together with like-minded people and kind of share and experiment with new ideas and suggesting and debating, what have you. And one such club was the Jacobin Club. It was a really, really radical one. And it was led by a great, great speaker who could really influence people with the way he spoke and kind of, passionately speaking, named Danton, George Danton. He was a speaker at the Jacobin Club and a city leader within the Paris Commune, and a very influential one. Seems he could just motivate people to his radical ideas very easily. Now, another one was Jean-Paul Marat. Jean-Paul Marat was another radical speaker within Paris and a very influential one. Interestingly enough, he also had a power of words because he published a radical newspaper called The Friend of the People. Would you read The Friend of the People if it was called The Friend of the People? Probably, because you'd believe it was the friend of the people. So how would you know it's a radical newspaper? Well, that's where you'd have to use your critical brain when you're realizing, hey, this is a biased radical newspaper, even though it's called the friend of the people. It's not really my friend, unless I'm a radical and all the other people are radical. Interestingly, take a look at these guys' dates here of death. More on that in a second. But these are two examples of extreme radicals who are figures leading the way, amongst many, who are leading the way of France turning into more radical ends. Okay, so this is inevitable as we look along after the royalty was abolished and the monarchy was abolished. The king was just a common citizen under the law. All right, no, nothing special, equal with everybody, not even any role in government. Okay, now he was tried for treason. He had been secretly communicating with other monarchs for support to regain his throne, overthrow the rebellion. Now that would be treason, and eventually, very easily condemned to execution by the guillotine. This actually happens 1793 in January. Less than the following year after the government or the people, the revolution abolished the monarchy. And he is killed by the guillotine. Now, here's the guillotine. We talked a little bit about it. It is a device for killing you by beheading you. And I think it's interesting to stop here and look at the guillotine itself as a device that employs Enlightenment ideals, as a very scientific way of killing you quickly and easily and reliably. And it can kill people very quickly, and it can kill a lot of them very quickly, and it can ensure that they're dead and that their death was relatively peaceful, okay, painless, whatever. You wouldn't have the mistake of the axe missing, for instance, or not going through. This would cut clean, fast, all the way through every time. Your head would drop, and they say, you have a couple seconds of consciousness left as the oxygen depletes in your brain when your head falls into the basket. Which would be kind of weird watching your head roll around after it got severed from your body, or maybe not watching it, but like seeing the world revolve a little bit as your head bobbled. Okay, now your body would be lifeless without the head relatively quickly as well. So kind of a very scientific way of killing somebody quickly, an Enlightenment piece of technology right there. More on that in a second. Okay, lots here. Let's unpack the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is the point of time within the French Revolution between 1793 and 1794, called the Reign of Terror because it was terrible, okay? There was a lot of terror and fear, all right? While France is building its army and finding some success, defending itself with pride, many regular citizens in France begin to actually long for the good old days of the old regime. Okay? This is interesting because it reminds me of that saying, you don't know what you had till it's gone. Now, why would you long for the old regime unless there were aspects of the French Revolution that you saw and didn't agree with that were just too radical and too far gone, especially after the killing of your beloved king, perhaps. Now, if you held allegiance to your king or any ideology that would have had preference for the restoration of the old regime, suddenly you have opposing viewpoints to the radicals who are actually in power, and you're actually seen as an enemy of the republic. And at this point, it's inevitable. Okay, I feel it's inevitable that a kind of lawless, crazy, extreme and radical experiment here that's going on in France would lead to kind of this, terrible reign of terror where people are being killed because they're a threat to what you fought for. And as soon as you resort to using your power to eliminate your enemies gruesomely, that just doesn't seem like a very, a thing that stands for the human rights and the natural rights of people. It's using terror to keep absolute power, which seems to me to be worse than having an absolute king in power. So a lot of people would have thought, like me at the time as well, of maybe restoring some of those elements of the old regime. Let's talk about Maximilien Robespierre. Here he is. He looks quite tidy. Maximilien Robespierre. He was among the Jacobins, who does have radical viewpoints, who does rise to power, and he and his followers set out to create in Paris this Republic of Virtue, to replace any old hints of the old regime, especially those hints of the traditional religion of the French people. Okay? And one of the things they did, which I find kind of interesting, is they tried to make the year more scientific by keeping it in 12 months, renaming all the months, and then making 30 days within each month, and then making each week have 10 days. That would be very logical and very systematic, be an interesting calendar, but suddenly flip that, that the way you're used to calculating time, nobody else in the world is doing it the way you do. And one of the objectives you have to having a 10-day week is that you actually get rid of Sunday, the day of worship. And that was an objective there with the Republic of Virtue. And you kind of throw out religion and try to set up this model of virtue, of being a good citizen as being kind of the epitome of what life's meant to be, rather than being a good Christian, right? So there's an interesting experiment that goes on, is the godlessness of the French Revolution and the Republic of Virtue. Okay, in 1793, the Committee of Public Safety is formed, and it essentially rules France, is made up of the influential in France and made up of the Jacobin radicals. It looks for enemies and seeks them out, enemies of the Republic, enemies of the rebellion, and it tries them and it executes them. And that's what the Committee of Public Safety does. You can see how that would be a very authoritative and threatening institution to come around and find people who are enemies of the revolution. Now, Marie Antoinette was executed. She was among those killed by the Committee of Public Safety. But actually, so were Robespierre's enemies and anyone who challenged his leadership. So when Maximilien Robespierre actually rises to power, anybody who seems to kind of threaten that position that he's held for himself with his closest and trusted people, okay, kabam, tried off with their heads, and he really kind of solidifies for himself then the power that he has. Okay, now, interestingly, again, you look at the former slide when we met Georges Danton. He was among those. He was executed by the Committee of Public Safety. Now, he was a valid radical at the time, okay, or prior to that, not too long before that. And then eventually the revolution takes him out. The guy Marat, which we talked about, had been murdered by some lady who didn't like him. So there were people like these radicals had a very short lifespan. You get into a very dirty business where you don't try, you're looking behind your back whether somebody's going to stab you or not. Maximilien Robespierre was the same way, which is why the Committee of Public Safety protected him and his own power. Okay, this point is called the Reign of Terror for very good reasons. There's estimation that 40,000 people were executed. I think 3,000 or something in Paris alone. But over the course of this time, France is just executing people left, right, and center. Now, interestingly, again, most of these citizens who are being executed are not from the second or first estate. Most of them, let's check this out. As I said, 80% were citizens of the former third estate, the very people the revolution was supposedly fought for. Okay, now France is not just starving its people and overtaxing its people, but it's actually killing its own people, executing them for being an enemy of the revolution. All right. Now, this does, in my opinion, have a happy ending. Why? Because eventually people just see where this is going, and Robespierre loses all support, and all faith in him is lost. He is too radical. People realize it. I don't know. Their eyes are finally opened. In any case, the members of the National Convention, they turn on him, and he is met with the same fate he sent so many others to, namely the guillotine, and he is one of the final to die in this period called the Reign of Terror. And it seems like getting rid of him got rid of the Reign of Terror, but it also leaves France in another vacuum of what the heck do we do now? Okay, that experiment failed. Oh boy, did it ever. Okay, so understandably, public opinion in France doesn't shift to be more radical, it shifts against that of being radical because you've seen what radicalism had done, and so it shifts more to the right. And the solution at that time was the drafting of yet another new constitution and a new government that would take control of France. So if you haven't counted this far, I think there's been four forms of government up to this one called the Directory in 1795. In the Directory, there was a two-house legislature, so still an elected legislative body, and an executive body of 5 people. So now executive powers isn't held by one king, it's held by 5 people in what's called the Directory. So again, another experiment. And actually, this doesn't have such a bad story here. Okay. The Directory does hold on to power for a good chunk of time and brings France a period of stability, but even then it falls into corruption and it leaves a vacuum open to Napoleon Bonaparte, an amazing young French general, to kind of come into that opportunity and take power, as we'll see in the next chapter. All right. I want to point out the high price of life's necessities. Okay, by 1795, people are still unable to afford life's basic necessities like bread. Okay, the French Revolution was fought with one cause being the high price of bread. And you're telling me 6 years later, you haven't figured that out? Okay, now that would have been an important one to try to get figured out. They hadn't. So, of course, the people are still upset. What they had set out to do didn't work, as we could see. Directory, a little bit of a good news story. Okay, we got some videos here, which I'm going to go ahead and play.
Fabulous French!
Hello and welcome to the news at When. When, 1789, when the people of France decided that King Louis XVI and his rich friends had been living the high life at their expense for long enough, and that it was time for common people to run the country. Here with more details is Bob Hale with the French Revolution report. Bob.
Thank you, Sam. Well, sacre bleu me, if that isn't France, which it is, if it's not the 1780s, which it is, and if that right there isn't a very angry Frenchman, which it is, and he's got every right to be, because back then France was very much a country of le haves and le have-nots, where the posh people have fine food, fancy clothes, palaces and helicopters, while the poor people, like this chap, don't even have the bread on their table. But how can... What? I don't think I did say helicopters. But how do these poshos afford all that stuff, I hear you ask? Well, by taking money from poor taxpayers, like our friend here, and then borrowing even more money from other countries, which means that by 1789, France is riddled with debt, and most French people are penniless and hungrier than an alligator on the moon. All while King Louis XVI and his posh chums are living it up big styly. Terrible, really, but I guess that's just the way things are, and there's not a lot you can do about it, right? Wrong! The commoners strike up a plan to remove the king and run the country themselves, which signals the start of the one and only, the world famous, ladies and gentlemen, it's the French Revolution! Vive la Revolution! Sorry, I get a bit carried away. And the revolutionaries don't hang around. They storm the Bastille, a famous old fortress here in Paris, partly to show the king who's boss and partly to steal a load of explosives. Oh! Well, that's angry mobs for you. So King Louis, fearing for his life, dresses up as a Russian aristocrat's butler, little bit weird, and runs off to hide up here in a place called something or other. A cunning plan that works this much. Yep, not at all. The king is captured, he's brought back to Paris and told that he's not in charge anymore. He keeps the crown, but he loses most of his power, influence, and helicopters. And that's what? I didn't say helicopters. And things go from bad to worse for King Louis. In 1792, France declares war on Austria, a neighbouring country who want the revolutionaries out and the king back in. So they tell the revolutionaries that if they don't put the king back in, they'll start doing some pretty horrible things to the French people. A very clever tactic that works this much. Yep, not at all. Turns out the revolutionaries just hate being told what to do. They completely ignore the threat, accuse the king of plotting with the Austrians, and cut his head off. Then they cut his wife's head off. And then, frankly, they just get a little bit carried away. Soon they are cutting heads off left, right and centre, declaring anyone who doesn't agree with everything they say as an enemy of the revolution, a crime punishable by, yes, you've guessed it, having your head cut off. In fact, if we look at the head cutting off-ometer, we can see that somewhere between 16 and 40,000 heads were cut off in just 2 years. So many, in fact, that they not only broke our thingy, but they had to invent a whole new head cutting off thingy called the guillotine. So, at that time, it was all cut his head off, cut her head off, cut his head off, cut her head off, until finally, after 5 long years and lots of heads being cut off, the people of France said, stop cutting people's heads off! And they took the man responsible for most of the heads being cut off, Maximilian Robespierre, and yep, you've guessed it, they cut his head off. And that's the end of the French Revolution, the end of the French royalty, and if I don't get a cup of tea and a biscuit in the next 3 seconds, it might very well be the end of old Bobsy. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. Oh, that feels so much better. You know, now I think of it, I did say helicopter there, didn't I? I think I just need a holiday. Sam, a couple of weeks in the Maldives?
Okay, so there you have a little bit of a French Revolution report with kind of a funny component to it. The next one I have is quite long, as well as is it 2 parts, this part and the next part. I think what I'll do is I'll see if I could find the links on YouTube and link them in the video description or in Google Classroom for you to take a look at. They will go more in depth into everything we've reviewed at this point. So I think that's what I'll do rather than playing them here now in this recording. Okay? 2 parts. You could also access the Google Slides and watch them that way if possible. That should work as well. Okay, now you can move on to the section review for chapter 21.2. Just a couple definitions, identifies, and answers, which give you the background, things that you should pull out of this chapter. Okay? We'll come back and review that in just a minute. So you go ahead, look at those questions, see what you can come up with. Let's begin our section review then, looking at the questions on page 491, starting with our definitions. Let's look at radical. Radical was somebody in the revolution who desired sweeping and radical changes. Okay. A lot of them would have originated from the working classes and the bourgeoisie of Paris, very influential across the rest of France. The émigrés, who were they? Do you remember? They were the nobility who had fled France during the times of the peasant uprisings, when France was getting to be unsafe for them. And they dwelt outside of France and still longed to come back to their original status. And there were a lot of them. They were powerful and wealthy, and would only wish for an opportunity to restore France after this revolution had kind of blown over. They were kind of an external threat to the revolution. The guillotine was the machine used for beheading, an Enlightenment machine that killed people swiftly and comfortably, humanely. Legislative Assembly was one of the governments of France. It was the group that succeeded the National Assembly. The National Assembly, you may remember, was the one that the people came up with after the Estates General was originally called back in 1789. The Reign of Terror was that point in time where Robespierre was ruling. It was a terrifying time, a terrible, terrifying time of terror for people because a lot of people were under the threat of being judged an enemy of the revolution. The Directory was the government that took control after the Reign of Terror, and it was a more moderate form of government, and it had a legislative body to it, but it also an elected legislative body, but it also had this kind of executive body of 5 men who kind of shared executive powers. We look at the question, what rights were proclaimed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man? And they are the following: liberty, property, the right to security, safety, and the right to resistance to oppression, your right to rebel against a tyrant. These things are not things we have seen, these things are things we've seen before in Enlightenment thinking, as well as in the American Revolution. Okay? Ideas that are kind of floating around in the world at the time. No doubt they would come into effect in France and kind of turn into this whole thing we call the French Revolution. What reforms did the National Assembly make in France's government? Let's take a look and see some of the things they did. What did it do? Well, first of all, it creates a limited monarchy, so it abolishes that absolute monarchy. So the king still has a role. It's a constitutional monarchy. His power is limited by law, which it wasn't before. And it creates departments, a whole different way of structuring the regions or territory of France, with actually officials who are appointed and elected based on merit and not necessarily status. So that is a huge development. What about the Catholic Church? Well, the civil constitution of the clergy took away the church's lands, took away their political independence and safety, and it put them underneath the power of the state. You had a state religion of the Catholic Church, which actually isn't technically really then the Catholic Church anymore. Catholic Church would have been run or headed by the Pope in Rome, and that would have been seen as an outside force. So you could see why the French people would be like, no, let's take control of that as well. Plus, the church has, that 10% of land that we can acquire and sell off and whatever, help with feeding people. Okay, number 4, what were the basic political divisions within the Legislative Assembly? So as the Legislative Assembly begins to hash itself out and try to work as a government, what ends up happening is that it is divided into conservatives, radicals, and moderates. And how does the seating arrangement within the Legislative Assembly affect the labels given to political groups, even to this day? Well, even today, radicals are seen as on the left, moderates in the middle, and a conservative is on the right. We have those titles even to this day. That comes to us from the French Revolution. Go ahead and briefly describe the Reign of Terror. Well, the Reign of Terror was a period in time in which Robespierre had almost dictatorial powers, executing many who were thought to be enemies of the revolution, enemies of himself and his radical views. How does it end? With the members of that National Convention. By the way, that National Convention was the government that eventually got rid of the constitutional monarchy and made France a republic, and that government turns against Robespierre and sends him to the guillotine, ending the Reign of Terror. And consider this. There's this saying, which I've never heard until I read this textbook. Apparently there's this saying, revolutions devour their own children. What evidence from the French Revolution supports this proverb? Well, I'd like you to think about this one a little bit. Let's think about this. I've just posted the answer anyways. Okay, guys like Robespierre, Marat, Danton, and many other revolutionary leaders, the leaders themselves, even Robespierre's radical enemies who are also radicals influencing radical change. I mean, it's not like there were any necessarily conservatives left who were outspoken in their viewpoints. Nobody would have the courage to do that. You would be killed. So even these most extreme radicals, though, were eventually executed or killed or murdered in the name of the revolution. And I think that's quite interesting because these guys are the names, the children of the revolution, the people who the revolution kind of gave birth to in a way, gave them the opportunity to voice their opinions and to be radical and to kind of project France into this radical direction. And yet that radicalism comes back to kill them. It devours them. Okay, let's look at this question. Why might revolutions in general have such an effect? And by the way, another factor here is that, the other children of the revolution are the ones who started it, the ones who were the most vulnerable and needy in this situation, which would have been the Third Estate. And the Third Estate being really the ones who had the most to win from the revolution, or actually ended up the ones who lost the most. They're the ones who were killed the most. Okay, they were the ones who lived in terror the most. And a lot of them, accepted revolution up to a point, but then after that opposed it, but then had to be silent. Otherwise, they would have been killed. Now, why do revolutions tend to have this effect? And this is why it's so important to study histories, because we can see here the French making mistakes that many other countries have repeated since, who are still trying to establish themselves and their governments, especially places in Africa, not necessarily to their own fault. But for us, we look at France's situation and see, okay, what does a revolution actually do? Especially one that's kind of violent and radical. Well, we've got to be safe and play a little bit cautiously. Looking at France's example here, revolution is violence. It's overturning something, especially when it's looking at a violent way to do so. A general climate of discontent and disorder, where you give the power to the mob, the irrational mob, and people who can manipulate that mob then have the real power. What you also have is you set that need for the newcomer or the person who's got the next idea to take on a more extreme position than their predecessors. And then what you have is kind of this revolution, not to something that's actually better, but something that's actually more radical and ends up being a little bit worse. So unfortunately, I wouldn't say the French Revolution was a very good experiment, especially if you had to live through it. In time, it does come to the Directory, which gives some establishment of peace. But we will see how it actually turns out, you could say, a little bit for the better with Napoleon in our next chapter. All right. Don't be lame. DBL. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in and watching this whole thing. Hopefully you didn't do it in one sitting. All right. See ya.